Well, ready to go, Clement? Okay, first of all, thank you. Let me also thank all the staff for their help, Elisa and Clement and Katrina. Thank you for your help in getting us to do this. And I apologize to our guests. You're nice to give us this time in the first place, but secondarily to have to leave to go vote. So we appreciate you very much. Today, as has been the state of things for a while, is one of those troublesome days as the virus continues to rise, and also our jobs report comes out on Thursdays, and 22.1 million Americans filed for unemployment last week, and at the beginning of the pandemic, that is. And so we now have 41 million jobs claims. And, those are Americans who are struggling to keep a roof over their heads and food in their stomachs and a heart, with at least some hope still resting there that things will get better shortly. I have never quite understood this. I grew up in a tough neighborhood. I grew up in public housing, and there was always a lot going on. But I never understood people who could get up in the morning with a goal to take something from someone, and maybe even worse, hurt them in the process. And so right now, criminals on our shores and around the world are taking advantage of this moment to steal from vulnerable families. And, our nation's vulnerable are hit twice. Once disproportionately by the virus, and then again, they become victims of this vicious virus in terms of their health. Just this past month, my home state of Missouri was cheated out of $8.25 million, which was paid to secure N95 masks. The Missouri delegation was just on the phone with Governor Parsons a couple of hours ago, and we, Blaine Luetkemeyer, who's also on this committee, and Congressman Clay, we all listened to the governor tell us how our state has just been ripped off, paying enormous amounts of money for the N95 masks, and then to have those disappear if they were ever shipped, and then some of them were fakes, and they're trying to figure out ways in which they can even use the fakes now to provide at least some minimal care for some of the frontline workers. And these masks, of course, were desperately needed. And last week, the Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, released a warning of medical scams related to COVID-19. And, right now, that is something that's occupying almost every little spot of my heart because, we're wasting money in trying to help people. And then there are those out there trying to hurt them in other ways. And ransom attacks are up 148% in March and 38% targeting financial institutions. And in April, Google reported 18 million daily COVID-19 malware and phishing emails, and 240 million COVID-19 related spam messages. So we've got a problem. The ranking woman is not here the chairwoman is not going to be able to be with us today. So I asked Mr. Perlmutter if he would like to share some comments. And then we'll go to Mr. Hill, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be quick. You've laid out the You know, the dire straits we're in with 1.7 million people having contracted this disease, 100,000 people having died from COVID-19. We just had a moment of silence in the House chamber to recognize all the deaths that we faced. And amidst that, criminals are going on a spree to take advantage of this situation. And the cyber crimes seem to be increasing to the point that we all have to be alert against the games that are being played and provide as much kinds of enforcement and protection as possible. So I look forward to hearing from our panelists. I thank the gentleman from Missouri for putting this roundtable together. And with that, I yield back to the chair.
Thank you. I want to yield now to the ranking member. I was kidding earlier. Mr. Hill is one of the most decent guys around here, and so I want to yield now to French Hill for his introductory remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this virtual roundtable. I look forward to more of these in our committee over the next few weeks. I appreciate the ability for the committee to be innovative and adaptable to continue our work in the face of the global pandemic. And certainly, I think it's appropriate that we think about today and discuss with this distinguished panel cyber threats and the potential to stop them and the potential to interdict those people who are trying to take advantage of COVID-19 and the burden that you guys have described on all of our families here and around the world. Cybersecurity, the need for strong cyber protocols has long been a topic of discussion in this committee, and this virus has only underscored the need to showcase our vulnerabilities in certain areas of our financial ecosystem. As many businesses are adapting to the new teleworking policies and the challenges that come with working from home, it's important that they have the right infrastructure in place to handle new security sensitivities. I was disappointed recently by a perpetrator who took advantage of the PPP program from Arkansas and committed fraud and has been arrested. I fear we're going to hear more of these stories as the weeks go ahead. FIS, Fidelity Information System, which is in my district, recently announced a big jump in credit card fraud, 35% increase in April. So we cannot let actions of a few bad actors inhibit our financial institutions, our entrepreneurs, our small business from being able to conduct their work safely and soundly. We need to find solutions that will mitigate potential threats, but still empower our communities. So I thank you for convening this roundtable. I look forward to the discussion, and I yield back.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. French. First I'd like to welcome Mr. Guillermo Christensen. Mr. Christensen is a partner in ICE Miller's Data Security and Privacy and White Collar Defense Groups. Mr. Christensen is a former CIA intelligence officer and a diplomat with the U.S. Department of State. Mr. Christensen, you may now give your introductory comments.
Members of the subcommittee and the staff for inviting me to join you for this roundtable today. Just as an aside, I was reminded that the last time I was in a congressional hearing, it was, as you can imagine, as an intelligence officer at CIA, a classified hearing where we would have frowned on the presence of internet cameras and microphones, and been rather nervous about that. And yet here we are, having this discussion in a highly dispersed, socially distanced setting that completely relies on this amazing public digital infrastructure of the internet that is so critically important to our economy and our lives. So I will confess I'm still getting used to some of this. You have my biography, obviously, but I wanted to touch on a couple of things on it that might help you when you're to use my knowledge to your benefit and any of my experience to your benefit and that of your constituents. I am a partner at a law firm, ICE Miller. It's over 100-year-old law firm based out of Indianapolis, but we have offices in a number of cities, including in DC, just down the street from the Capitol, where I would normally be if not at home. But much of what I do is informed by and shaped by what I did in the government before I became a lawyer as an intelligence officer and in the State Department. And I do very much treasure the fact that what I do today is still, in general, helping the public interest. We are combating those cyber criminals that you speak of. We're helping companies deal with the circumstances and the implications of those. The work we do generally, I like to describe as being either on left of boom or right of boom, meaning we try to help people before something bad happens, which is where I prefer to be, or the right of it, which is unfortunately what we end up spending a lot of time dealing with. One of the projects that I was involved recently that we are going to provide you with the paper is something that we did with the Department of Homeland Security. And it's called the commodification of nation state threats. And the idea is that much of what we're going to talk about today is no longer exotic stuff. It's not weapons of highly sophisticated code. It's a business run by people who have franchises and distribution networks. And they're very good. They make a lot of money. And they're going to war with small companies, small businesses that don't have the defenses to stand up and be able to deal with that. What's the pandemic having to do with this? Well, in a sense, we've pushed all our private conversations onto the internet because we're doing conversations like this. And that is creating a much greater surface for vulnerability. So with that, thank you very much for this invitation. And I look forward to trying to help you and your constituents in dealing with these issues.
Thank you very much. Next, I would like to introduce Tom Kellermann, Head of Cybersecurity Strategist for VMware Incorporated. Previously, Mr. Kellermann was the Chief Cybersecurity Officer for Carbon Black Incorporated. Prior to joining Carbon Black, Mr. Kellermann was the CEO and founder of Strategic Cyber Ventures. Mr. Kellermann.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, members of the subcommittee. Yes, I'm Tom Kellermann, and I've been studying the dark web for 22 years and working in cybersecurity. You know, the financial sector has long been the target of the elite cyber criminal guilds of the world. And that being said, they're also the best defended from that regard. But I've sent to the subcommittee my report called Modern Bank Heists, which highlights how financially motivated cyber criminals have evolved the bank heist into a hostage situation. We're seeing a high level of innovation from cyber criminals. They're leveraging new tactics, new weaponry. Some of these very cyber criminals are protected by nation states and seen as a Robin Hood phenomenon. At an alarming rate, you see transnational organized crime groups leveraging specialist providers of cybercrime tools and services to conduct a wide range of crimes against the financial sector, from ransomware to distributed denial of service attacks to business email compromise, and recently something called access mining, when you can purchase access to a specific bank or to a specific individual's computer. They're increasingly sharing their resources and information and reinvesting their illicit profits into the development of new, even more destructive capabilities. Since the beginning of the COVID surge, we at VMware Carbon Black have seen or observed an increase of 238% of targeted attacks against the US financial sector. Cyber criminals are fully taking advantage of COVID, and they're doing so in tandem with the US news cycle. Like I said, the events of today are evolving from a heist to a hostage situation. And according to the Modern Bank Heist report, which is attached, we've seen a 13% increase of attacks against the sector over the past year. 25% of financial institutions noted that they had seen destructive attacks where the adversary was fighting back and destroying the internal networks of their institutions as a form of counter-incident response. And 33% of surveyed financial institutions said they encountered island hopping, not just about their supply chain being compromised to be used to attack them, but more importantly, once they were attacked, their infrastructure and digital transformation was used to attack their customers. Cyber criminals are evolving in both attack sophistication and organization, and we must take advantage of the strategic public policy opportunities in front of us. So first, I think it's imperative that shared service providers to the financial sector be held to comply with the FFIEC Information Security Handbook, as they are being targeted for the purposes of island hopping to compromise of financial institutions at a time. Second, tax credits for cybersecurity investment would be necessitated so that it's not viewed as an expense anymore, but a functionality of maintaining safety and soundness. The United States Secret Service should be migrated back into Treasury and their budget should be increased as they are the tip of the spear when it comes to criminal investigations as it relates to cybercrime and financial crime. And then anti-money laundering and forfeiture regulations should be modernized to seize the virtual currencies and alternative payments which are used in cybercrime conspiracies. Those seized funds should be explicitly allocated to critical infrastructure in the U.S. That's taking them out of the dark web. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Finally, I'd like to introduce Naftali Harris, co-founder and CEO of SentiLink, a product that works to detect synthetic fraud. Mr. Harris was also the first data scientist at the online lender, a firm, and built and led their risk decisioning team. Mr. Harris, you may now give your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, as well as Ms. McHenry, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm honored to be here and excited to share some of the cyber threats we're seeing during this crisis. I'd like to talk about synthetic fraud, which is the most significant risk issue facing the financial services industry today. The pandemic and the resulting recession have made that much worse. Synthetic fraud is when a criminal makes up a fake person and uses that fake person to commit financial crimes. They start by inventing a fake name, date of birth, and SSN, and then trick the 3 credit bureaus into creating a credit report for that fake person. Once they've done that, they can pass KYC checks and open up accounts at financial institutions. They use these synthetic identities to steal money, launder funds, and commit other kinds of financial crimes. We estimate that synthetic fraud cost US lenders $1 to $2 billion of losses last year, and expect the losses to be a lot higher this year because of the crisis. But this problem also impacts local, state, and federal governments. That's because fraudsters use synthetic identities to apply for benefits like Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, and even SNAP benefits. The PPP funds are particularly at risk. Fake businesses with synthetic owners are able to access CARES Act money, since most organizations distributing the money, quite frankly, don't have checks for synthetic fraud. Bad actors are also adding fake employees on payrolls to inflate the loan amounts they're eligible for. And this is already happening. Just last week, a man from Texas was indicted for making up 400 fake employees and trying to steal $5 million. But the ones who are being caught today are only the dumbest of the criminals. We estimate that between $3.3 and $7.9 billion of the program will go to fake businesses or employees. The taxpayer dollars that the bad actors are stealing should have gone to struggling small businesses. But synthetic fraud also undermines our national security, since accurate KYC checks are critical for keeping Americans safe from terrorism and other threats. And it also causes real problems for young people and immigrants, because these people have shorter histories and are harder to distinguish from synthetic identities. Fortunately, all of us here can stop this. For our part, we founded SentiLink with a mission to end fraud in the United States. We use machine learning and technology to detect fraud in real time, but employ a team of manual investigators to show the models where to look. You've learned a lot from this experience, and I appreciate your attention to this important issue. But I'd also like to call on banking regulators to modernize KYC and AML regulations and to incorporate synthetic fraud into bank exams. The solutions that we and others have built for the private sector can also be used by government agencies such as the SBA. And in fact, given the importance of the PPP to the nation, today I'd like to offer our services to the SBA free of charge, should they be interested. Lastly, as a citizen, I'd just like to thank all the members of this committee for their hard work to support a financial services industry that's robust, efficient, fair, and capable of delivering value to all Americans. I look forward to helping in a small way by answering your questions.
Well, first, I'd like to thank all of our guests for being generous with your time today. And I'll now turn over to the committee staff to acknowledge members for their questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cleaver. We'll first start with you for 3 minutes for your questions.
All right, thank you. Mr. Kellermann, look, we are blessed to have you guys with us today, so thank you very much for coming and sharing your expertise. You noted a number of cybercrime spikes that could be attributed to the COVID-19 in the documents you provided to the members here on the subcommittee. cyber attacks against the financial sector increasing 238% since January. Ransomware attacks against the financial sector increasing by 9% from the beginning of February to the end of April. And you also noted in May during an interview that while financial institutions have the best network security in the world, they have the best budgets in the world, but network security is not working in today's world. And they are being challenged by some of the best hackers in the world. That includes nation states. You will not be able to keep them out 100% of the time. Your comments that I've just quoted. Can you discuss with us, if you would please, the awareness level of financial institutions and regulators of fintech vulnerabilities that may be exploited during this pandemic?
Yes, sir. First of all, financial institutions had the best security in the world, but because of telework and because of the customized malware or weaponry that are being developed in the dark web, primarily the Russian-speaking dark web, which is Eastern European, they've learned ways around the perimeter defenses of the network security espoused by the standard and regulators of the world. Telework allows for a hacker to hack the executive at home, tunnel in through the VPN tunnel, and not only steal from the financial institution, but to commandeer their digital transformation efforts and to have that institution's website, network, and or mail server begin to attack its constituency via what's called island hopping, a very troubling trend, which is why I referenced this in the heist report, that's transitioned from a heist to a hostage situation. When it comes to fintech, their greatest vulnerability of fintech is they build out these APIs to allow them to connect to other financial institutions as well as other fintech vendors. And those APIs themselves are being exploited left and right because of web application attacks in today's world.
Well, thank you. I think my time is running out. I asked Mr. Christensen, based on his background, whether he thought that we are doing anything, or it seems as if we're losing this battle. Is there anything going on, that would give us some hope that our counterintelligence agencies and fintech will all be able to eventually get their arms around this issue? You can not answer it now. We'll move on to the next member, but at some point we might want. I'd like to get your response.
Thank you, Mr. Cleaver. We'll now go to Mr. Hill for 3 minutes for his questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me also thank the staff for smoothly operating the technology. We appreciate all of your efforts. The first question that came to mind was, Mr. Kellermann, you referenced the advantages of coordination information sharing in financial institutions. Our ranking member, Patrick McHenry, has a bill, HR 4458, which would require the bank regulators to really do a much better job of coordinating, which may also have the aspect that Mr. Harris had noticed, the better examination standards. You know the system well. What should those regulators be doing with our regulated institutions?
Well, they should ensure there's no systemic risk in the sector to ensure that the service providers, the shared service providers that are specific to the financial sector have the same level of security that the financial institutions have that they are providing services to, number one. Number two, they're not looking in the vault to see if anyone's there. What I mean by that is they should mandate the use of what's called cyber threat hunting by institutions that prove that the institutions are actually looking for secret passageways or presences of criminals that already exist within their infrastructure and rooting them out. That is not something that has been mandated, and it is necessitated. And lastly, sir, there's a governance issue here. The chiefs of security, the CISOs of the financial sector, are still in large part reporting to the CIOs. That's the defensive coordinator reporting to the offensive coordinator, sir. It just doesn't work. The defensive mindset's not being purveyed at the top of the ladder.
That's very helpful. I mean, we know that we have in the IT exam internal and external penetration testing, but your view is in that is to get it one layer deeper on both internal, external, and look for people who are already in the system. That's a very interesting point. Mr. Harris, let me turn to you. Before I was on this subcommittee, I helped lead the AI task force. I know Dr. Foster, who's leading that effort, is very concerned about synthetic fraud. How would you see changing that IT exam to look for synthetic fraud? What should we do in the IT exam in banks to better exam against somebody who's going to create synthetic identities?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think that we should, in our bank exams, ask the financial institutions what they're doing about synthetic fraud. I think that there are actually many approaches to detecting synthetic fraud. The one that we take uses AI and machine learning, but there are others as well. And on their examinations, I think the banks should be asked what they're doing to prevent that kind of fraud and whether that actually is effective.
Good. Thank you for that. Yield back to you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
We'll now go to Mr. Perlmutter for 3 minutes for his questions.
Thank you. And my questions go to Mr. Harris and Mr. Christensen. And just thinking about the Paycheck Protection Program that we just instituted, and a lot of money passed to small businesses, billions and billions of dollars, reminded me of an old book by Kurt Vonnegut called God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, which was when a lot of money passes from one person to another, from one entity or another, an enterprising criminal can siphon a bunch off without being noticed. And so going back to the synthetic fraud, have you, either of you, noticed any fraudulent IDs, any efforts to siphon off some of that paycheck protection money or some of the other federal monies that have been flowing to individuals and businesses because of this damn virus? And I'll open it to both of you. Mr. Harris, why don't you go?
Thank you, Congressman. We actually work with a subset of the financial institutions that are distributing the PPP funds. And I'm happy to say that we've stopped some of these attempts to steal taxpayer dollars, but we don't work with all of them. And that's how we were able to estimate that overall $3.3 to $7.9 billion of these funds will go to synthetic fraud. And in fact, the Justice Department, to their great credit, is already starting to prosecute some of these criminals. And I mentioned the $5 million case from last week. I believe there's a $20 million case from today. And earlier this month, in New England, 2 men tried to steal about $500,000, in all cases by creating fake employees that they tried to use to fund non-existent businesses and steal all the money that should have gone to struggling small businesses. So we're certainly seeing this, and I would suggest at least that the USDA consider checking for this kind of fraud themselves as well.
Mr. Christensen, from your perch, what have you seen?
We have been seeing the same kinds of attacks, although the techniques need not be that sophisticated. Not that synthetic identities are always that sophisticated, but the reality is for small businesses and even medium-sized businesses, what we are often seeing are fairly pedestrian types of attacks where email accounts are being taken over, account numbers are being changed, fake instructions are being issued. And in part because of the confusion and disruption of COVID-19, companies are not paying as much attention to these things. They're feeling they may get a message, for example, from a customer. I'm sorry, our bank closed and now we need to use this account. And everyone's trying to help each other. And of course, criminals take advantage of that willingness to help. It's a very powerful weapon. So I would say that the technology is perhaps less important. More important in some ways is understanding the business processes that can help to prevent these, to mitigate these from inside the company.
All right, thank you. My time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Rose for 3 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver and Ranking Member Hill, for holding this roundtable. And I'll just jump straight into my questions. Mr. Kellermann, in your statement, you brought up that the idea of moving the United States Secret Service back under the Treasury Department. Can you discuss how moving the Secret Service to Treasury might be beneficial in the fight against cyber criminals?
Yes. The CID division, the Criminal Investigative Division of Secret Service, has long been the forefront, the tip of the spear against crimes precipitated in the financial sector. They're understaffed, they're under-resourced. They've been competing with priorities within DHS. In addition, because it's Treasury, I feel that the only way to truly pacify or civilize the dark web is to go after the money in the dark web, to follow the money in the dark web and take it out of the ecosystem of the cyber criminals that it's being used to develop weaponry, to trade in goods and services that create such an economy of scale. And so within Treasury, they could help FinCEN and a number of other organizations to improve forfeiture and anti-money laundering constraints as they go after the monies themselves.
Thank you. Mr. Christensen, I wanted to ask you, based on your previous experience as the Science and Technology Advisor to the U.S. mission to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, if you could discuss any areas in which you see room for improved international cooperation to combat cybersecurity crimes related specifically to the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you. That's an excellent point for us to pivot off from some of what we're talking about, because the internet is the ultimate international organization in some respects and platform. And we are, I think, the Department of Justice and others, from what we see, are doing what they can at this point to try to develop better relationships. But we're chasing criminals that, as Tom mentioned, are running from one electronic island to another. And they stay ahead of the traditional tools of law enforcement very well. Many of them are in places that we're never going to get to through traditional law enforcement, extradition, multilateral treaties, and the like. Every now and then, one or two of them foolishly decide to go visit Disneyland, and they get met by our people at Plainside, but it's the rare occasion. So more international cooperation is absolutely critical, but it has to change. The speed of international cooperation on law enforcement right now is still 1800s, 1900s. It's not 21st. We need to digitize that part of it, and that's something that it would be incredibly helpful to trace the money and track the criminals.
Thank you. I see my time is about to expire, so I'll yield back the balance. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Heck for 3 minutes for his questions.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Good. Well, I want to thank the panelists very much for joining us today. Turns out I represent the state of Washington, which has been the hardest hit by the unemployment insurance fraud scheme perpetuated by the cybercrime groups like the Nigerian-based Scattered Canary. Scattered Canary's recent operations only came to light just last week, but it's already clear that they have done an incredible amount of damage and defrauded taxpayers of literally millions and millions of dollars. Now, our state has fought to stop the flow of funds to the fraudsters, but frankly, I'm worried Scattered Canary and groups like them will continue to wreak havoc during the pandemic and beyond. And since the passage of the Budget Control Act in 2011, we've seen a loss in talent and resources across government investigative bodies, from the FBI to the Secret Service. White-collar prosecutions, as point in fact, are less than half of what they were just 9 years ago. I'm really pleased the Secret Service identified Scattered Canary's operations, but I'm under no illusion that they're acting alone. At a time when massive amounts of federal resources are being distributed across the United States, I am more concerned than ever that the hollowing out of our investigative capacity over the last decade leaves us vulnerable. Excuse me. And so, Mr. Christensen, you've spent considerable time investigating international and domestic financial crimes at the CIA and the FBI, and you now conduct in-depth diligence of third parties for your clients in the private sector. So between the federal government and the private sector, how can we fill investigative gaps during the COVID-19 pandemic, sir?
One thing that we desperately need to do is to improve our technical game. As Mr. Kellermann mentioned before, there are resources certainly in the federal government and at the state level that are better than others, that are more technically proficient and understand the the challenges of digital crime. But we are always playing catch up to the criminals in this area. It's a little bit, it's part of how technology works. It's one part of it. But the other part is that it's very hard to find people who are as qualified as some of these criminals, frankly, the hackers, the criminal hackers, to take apart their schemes and trace them. I think we have to play a much stronger defense in this area. And that is a technology and a human engineering problem. And I'm happy to touch on some of the issues. I think we need to have much broader application of encryption and authentication, digital authentication in our economy. That is the key to having trust and resilience. And that is something that, it's controversial, but I think it's very important for us to have a good handle on.
I'll go to Mr. Timmons for 3 minutes for his question.
Thank you. And thank you, Chairman Cleaver and Republican Leader Hill. I appreciate y'all hosting this. My first question is on video conference and conference calls. I'm sure, like all of you, we've been using Zoom and WebEx, Teams, Ring Central, you name it. I mean, everyone is trying to fight over this space. And really, this is to any of the panelists. What role can the federal government play in finding an economy of scale and an efficiency? Should we try to have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches all kind of buy into one platform and make that the platform of choice? Is there a role that we could play there?
So if I may, sir, my bias at this point, given that even though it's a relatively mature technology in some respects, doing it at scale, which is what we're talking about now, is a little bit different, and building in the security from the outset and the many more creative ways in which we can use the technology than what we're doing now. Telemedicine, for example, has an incredible potential. Lawyers are now doing remote depositions. We're going to be doing arbitrations over distance. Trials will be done over these tools. So they're going to be used in very different ways. The key, I think, to understand the risk here is everything we're doing right now could be and is being captured. Every bit, 0 and 1, is being captured. And if it's not properly safeguarded, I'd like to joke, historians are going to have a great time in 20 or 30 years. They don't have to think about what was said in that room that no one ever gets into. They're just going to be able to queue up the video and they'll know it. Right? So the criminals will be doing the same thing. And they can search this video. They have their tools that allow you to search text. Soon,
Sure.
So there's a lot of vulnerability there.
I appreciate that. My next question is for Mr. Harris. So synthetic ID fraud is obviously a major problem. You said between 3 and 7 billion. I imagine DOJ is going to go after that money, and many people will be prosecuted and convicted. It seems the easiest thing to do is to address the Social Security Administration's shortcoming in providing a real-time identity check that is more efficient and more accurate. Is there something that we can do on that front? Do you agree that's one of the challenges right now with synthetic ID fraud?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think that synthetic fraud in the United States, frankly, comes from our broken identity system. In the United States, we have a concept of a social security number, and we have 3 experts here on cybersecurity. Social security numbers in the United States are effectively used as usernames. They're supposed to uniquely identify somebody. They're also used as passwords. They're supposed to be secret. And with all the data breaches that have happened, they're also effectively available on the dark web. So
Thank you, Mr. Harris. I'll follow up with a question in person. I yield back. Thank you.
We'll now go to Mr. Himes for 3 minutes for his questions.
Thank you to our participants today. Really appreciate it. I've got a question that I'd like Mr. Kellermann and Mr. Harris to address. And then if I have time, I have a question for Mr. Christensen as well. The question for Mr. Harris and Mr. Kellermann. A lot of us worked pretty hard on the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015, which of course set up that protocol for there to be sharing of malware and other information and signatures and that sort of thing between the private sector and the government. I've heard mixed reviews about how robust and valuable that interaction is. So my question is, what's your take on the communication and the flow of information back and forth? And if it's not what it should be, what can we do to make it better?
So thank you so much for developing that legislation and promulgating it. I think that it's gotten dramatically better in the last 18 months. And I would tip my hat to the leadership of CISA, Christopher Krebs, and for General Nacazone over at the NSA for their work in this area of late. I guess the challenge sometimes is we overclassify data, frankly. We don't need to know who or what they hit. We need to understand how and perhaps why it was effective.
I'll chime in as well. Yeah, I would say that the information sharing between the private sector and the public sector is very valuable, but could be better. Within financial services that we understand best, the same bad actors that we identify for defrauding financial institutions are also going after the federal government and other state governments. And I think better information sharing between the private and public sector can help to stop a lot of these.
Mr. Harris, that's terrific. Thank you. We don't have time to cover it, but I would be grateful if you know what your specific suggestions would be to make that information sharing better. And I'm delighted to hear that the communication is good. Mr. Christensen, question for you. This is obviously a transnational problem in which we have similar interests to, in many cases, our adversaries. Anybody can be a victim of this, including Iran and Russia and China. What do we need to do to cooperate better, even with our adversaries in this in this realm?
I think in some ways, the genie is definitely out of the bottle in terms of some of the technology that weaponizes the threat that we're talking about now. And some of it came from the United States, some of it came from other countries, but it's now this is knowledge, digital knowledge, that hackers in their own way develop into better and better tools. And you're absolutely right. This has the victims are going to be regardless of nationality and where they are. I think we need to have a more robust dialogue, a little bit like what we developed in the past along nuclear deterrence or safety on the seas or other common problems like that, and begin talking about the digital weapons, the digital marketplaces where these weapons are being developed.
Great, thank you.
We'll now go to Mr. Garcia for 3 minutes for his question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and of course to the ranking member Hill, and to all the panelists. All of you have highlighted the risks of cyber threats present in our financial sector and our government during COVID-19. One concern I've had lately is about the Federal Reserve's contract with an arm of BlackRock, the Financial Markets Advisory, or FMA, to manage the Fed's bond buying programs. FMA is handling extremely valuable confidential information of our government, but at the same time, it works for other governments and private clients around the world. We don't have any reason to believe that FMA's other clients have our best interests in mind. Are you concerned that arrangements like the contract between the Fed and FMA open us up to potential attacks and leave our financial markets vulnerable? To any of the panelists.
So thank you, Congressman Garcia. I'll maybe kick it off a little bit. In my work, I also do a fair amount of business through the Treasury Department's Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which, among other things, looks at the flow of direct investment from outside the United States and the impact it has on national security. And this is a very evolving picture in terms of our understanding of how other countries and sometimes their state-owned enterprises and businesses can inject risk, national security risk, into our economy. 20, 30 years ago, we thought about it just in terms of industrial defense base. And now we're worried about, rightfully, about social media companies that may be exploited by foreign governments. There are, I think, we've developed a lot of good protocols for understanding how to assess these issues. I'm not familiar in particular with the situation you're describing, but I'm comfortable that there are ways in which we can analyze those risks through analyzing contracts, the shareholders involved, the ownership structures, and then put in place structures in certain situations that can mitigate some of those risks.
Thank you. Any the others?
I would just state that the connective tissue technologically between the two is probably going to be targeted by nation states, and encryption won't solve that problem. And so there must be a much more robust strategy of security around that, which should be intrinsic to the environment.
Thank you.
To Mr. Cleaver to conclude today's roundtable.
Yeah, thank all of you for being here. But before we conclude, I wanted to find out if Mr. Hill had any concluding remarks.
Just to say, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the hearing. I found it very enlightening. I appreciate the testimony of the witnesses and their handout materials, and look forward to following up. Yield back.
Yeah, likewise. I thank you very, very much for your generosity in terms of donating time. I apologize for the late start because of the votes that were called. But I tell you, your comments were actually very informative, but also scary. I think all of us probably realized that we were vulnerable, and that we are this COVID-19 as if it has done anything other than decimated our country and created all kinds of financial and medical issues for us to eventually resolve. But also it's opened the door for a whole new batch of criminals. And I'm hoping that between FinCEN and the other agencies that in our government that are trying to figure out ways in which to stop the cyber criminality, that something can be done with a much stronger sense of we can get it done than right now. Because just listening to everybody, I can't say that I'm going to leave this roundtable feeling like, oh, boy, we got them running. They're on the run. I don't think that's the case, but it's reality, and we needed the reality. So thank you very much for painting the very real picture for us. Thank you very much. Thank you all the members for staying around.